And we are live, guys. Welcome to Disrupting Kidney Care, the place to discuss all things related to kidney health, from value-based care to home dialysis options to new technologies and the patient perspective. Of course, those are all topics we covered. I'm Dr. Qasim Butt, a nephrologist of over 13 years who's kind of ventured out into the medical technology space, but I still practice medicine part-time to keep it a little legit in scrubs, okay? I'm uber excited for this one, because I typically get to do a panel discussion with 3 different experts about a certain topic, right? But this one is different because I get to do a one-on-one interview with Tom Mueller, the author of the book, How to Make a Killing. And you see it right here too, right? This is round 7 of my Disrupting Kidney Care series. We are at over 490 attendees for this one, guys, so it's very successful. If you're in the audience right now, hit up that like and share button, but also in the comment section, tell me who you are. What's your connection to kidney care? Are you a doctor? Are you a nurse? Are you a patient? Are you a technologist? Are you an administrator? What's your relationship to kidney care? But also tell me if you've read his book, if you've read Tom's book and what you thought about it. And along the way, don't be shy to ask any questions. Put them in the comment section or any comments you have. And at the end, we'll do a little Q&A with me and Tom, and we can answer any of the questions you have about it, all right? Now, this book created a lot of commotion in the dialysis industry because it started pointing out a lot of the faults in the practice of nephrology over the last several decades, and quite honestly caused a lot of controversy amongst doctors, amongst dialysis companies as well. Please welcome the author and investigative journalist from Italy, Tom Mueller. Tom, how's it going?
Very well, Qasim. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate this. This is like my first grown-up interview. So, like,
well, I mean, joking aside, it's always great to be able to share notes and get views from insiders. I mean, from nephrologists, from people in the industry. Every time I have a conversation like this, I learn more about an incredibly fascinating but very complex area.
Yeah, and it's that's what I loved about your book, because it touched about so many different things. Some of them very controversial, some of the stuff I disagree with, some of them I agree with, and some of the stuff I was really enlightened by because it was new to me that this happened. But let's just start off with this, man. So over the years, I've gotten a chance to meet a lot of executives, a lot of entrepreneurs, and I've oftentimes found out that the entrepreneurs oftentimes more interesting than the company or organization they founded. And I found that, like, similarly with you, I read your book, I generally liked it. But when we talked, I was like, man, this guy's got a good story too, you know? So tell us about your journey into where you are right now, where you started and how it got there.
Well, I'm going to have to work on getting some more interest into my writing and out of my life.
Yeah.
I started off planning to be an academic, did a PhD in history, realized that was not for me, took a complete left turn, went into finance and worked for an investment bank, Goldman Sachs, for a while in mergers and acquisitions. Realized that was not for me, took another left turn, started traveling. And while I was traveling, when the money started to run out, I started thinking, I better figure out a plan for paying the bills. And I thought, there are some people who travel and write about that and call it a job. And so I started doing travel writing. Pretty soon that was pretty sort of superficial, but it's very hard to write travel writing really well. And so at that point, I had moved to Italy and I started writing about mafia in politics and more investigative stuff. And from there, moved on to olive oil fraud, whistleblowing, and now dialysis.
You said olive oil fraud, right?
So olive oil fraud, yes, exactly.
That's an amazing topic. That's an amazing topic. And is that how you wound up in Italy? Is that how it happened? Or was you in Italy and then you did all that kind of stuff?
It was while I was in Italy that I discovered olive oil as a great topic. I saw these farmers blockading a port in southern Italy, saying that some fake oil was coming in and undercutting their honest labors. And so I thought, now that is a story. And I wrote a story for the New Yorker on that, and then a book.
So as you got into investigating, you got into, I guess, whistleblowing, obviously, and finding these kind of sources, right? So I got a chance to watch one of your TED Talks last night that you did on whistleblowing itself, and how there's a dichotomy of perception of a whistleblower, right? They can either be viewed as a truth teller or a traitor, right? Or maybe even a snitch, like in the mafia, right? And we all know that snitches get stitches, right? So, If they're, if you're with the mafia, you're lucky if you get stitches, right? But like, why do we have that dichotomy when we talk about someone we consider a whistleblower? Why is that perception there?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that people perceive truth tellers quite often as upstanding and as what they would do as long as they're outside of their own sphere. So if someone blows a whistle on some big pharma company that you don't know anything about, or on the Catholic Church or whatever, you think, good for them, they stood up. You don't think much more about it. But if that same person happens to be in your organization, they become this sort of a demonic figure. They are a traitor. They are a coward. And it's a very interesting psychological dynamic to see the organization treat a whistleblower almost like, I don't know, the immune system attacks an antigen. And people are doing these very peculiar. I mean, you hear whistleblowers, the stories that they tell are just stunning about how from one day to the next, when the word comes out that they have blown the whistle, even if it's wrongdoing that everyone knows about and everyone has said, oh, I can't believe we're doing this. As soon as someone actually speaks out, they become the enemy and they're ostracized. No one talks to them anymore. The whole dynamic changes, and it's a very hard road. But it was fascinating to spend a lot of time with whistleblowers and with people who thought that whistleblowing was a good thing, just as long as it wasn't in their own shop. Yeah, exactly. And
but how do you tell, like, if a whistleblower is telling the truth or are they disgruntled? I mean, is it typically the whistleblower comes to someone like yourself, or do you seek out a whistleblower? Do you see what I'm saying? How does that typically happen?
Yeah, the key thing about whistleblowing is it's not about the person, it's about the facts. Okay. I don't care if they are in their spare time bad people, if they're disgruntled, if they've done crimes, if they're really lousy to their spouse, whatever. It doesn't matter. If they have good facts, then you need to pay attention to them. That's how the law is written, but that's not how human beings behave. So as soon as a whistleblower comes forward with legitimate beef against a corporation, the first thing the corporation does is not face the message, but destroy the messenger. They start accusing that person of doing the exact same thing that they are accusing the corporation of. They start saying that their home life is a mess and that they're philanderers and that they abuse their children, all kinds of.
They bring up existential other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not, at first I thought, wow, that's a really clever playbook. But over time I began to realize, hey, this is actually instinctive in us. People do this. It's not, there is a corporate PR playbook, but quite often it's put aside and people just react in this visceral way when it's people within their own shop. And so if someone is a whistleblower, but they're also a disgruntled employee, I mean, most whistleblowers are fired before they blow the whistle, because most whistleblowers that I talk with anyway, they thought they were going to be the talk of the town. They were going to be the life of the party at the company for saving their company from this horrible mess. Little did they realize that this horrible mess is a fraud scheme that their boss's boss dreamed up. And they only realize it when the pink slip comes and they're like, what? Wait, I'm fired for some bizarre thing, right? And then they blow the whistle. Some do. Most just move on. But it's an interesting thing that that most whistleblowers are, in one sense or another, disgruntled because they've been betrayed by their organization. But that's okay. That doesn't matter. What matters is, do they have good facts or not? If they do, listen to them.
Interesting. So, like, in the age of cable news and social media, where do you think the state of, like, investigative journalism is? Like, and I liked your book because it was well thought out, clearly researched, and everything like that. But where do you think that is now at this point?
Oh, it's in big trouble. I mean, we're fewer and fewer local news outlets, which is really where sort of the key stories get into our circulatory system. More and more reliance on sort of, word of mouth, people who really aren't serious about journalism, putting stuff on Facebook. It's tricky. It's also tricky to get to drive change, because you have a lot of people who are looking for the and this is another thing I learned from whistleblowers, is beware the press, because as most reporters want a one and done story. They want a really punchy headline, but when the story breaks and the proverbial shit hits the fan and the whistleblower is under pressure, the reporter's nowhere to be seen. So oddly, not only is there less and less quality investigative journalism, but there's less and less emphasis on making that journalistic information drive change.
Well, I would also point back as like, I think the attention span of most people is so diminished now, right? So they don't have time for a book. They barely have time for a podcast, and quite honestly prefer a meme to tell them the story, right? So there's a lot of components there, I think, with this. But let's get to your book, because by the way, it's missing an autograph. I'm just saying, I'm just going to suggest it.
I got to fix that.
You want to go ahead? You want to go ahead? But let's just get into the book, because I loved it, because it told a history of my industry, which is something I was quite honestly ignorant of. So let's start off like almost from the beginning of what the concept of dialysis started. And it was really World War II that really started driving the initiation of a dialysis. Is that correct?
Right. In World War II, obviously there were a lot of military casualties, a lot of kidney injuries, and people who died again, kind of who should, according to apart from brief kidney failures, who would have survived if they had something to tide them over until their bodies could recover, until their kidneys could recover. Same with civilians. I mean, during the Blitz, there was crush syndrome, which was this sort of mysterious thing that happened. People would be in a house that collapsed. They would be apparently uninjured or not badly injured. They go on for a week or two and suddenly would die of acute kidney failure.
And you know what that is? You know what that is? That's something called rhabdomyolysis. So essentially your muscle tissue breaks down and it plugs up your kidneys, and you need time for them to recover. So it's really fascinating that you brought that up. I was like, oh my God, this is rhabdo.
Okay. So, and that's the perfect example of why you need dialysis in this particular case, to tide someone over so that their body can restart, right? Their kidneys in particular can restart. And and so there were some amazing inventive, I mean, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, nephrologists were absolutely cutting edge pioneers of high-tech medicine. And so the earlier ones like Pim Kolf and Alwell in Sweden, during the war, they were scavenging the landscape, getting, bicycle pumps and pieces from downed fighter planes.
Yeah, I saw that. That's amazing. Yeah, literally aircraft, like literally just
and sausage casings for filters for the blood and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, they had to kind of make do, and they were trying to save people's lives.
They were like MacGyvering medicine, essentially, right?
Exactly.
It was like they were being MacGyver and just coming up with random stuff. It was amazing. But I guess I mean, the need justifies all this, creates all this, innovation just in itself, right? Like at the time.
Exactly. And at the same time, again, we're talking about an era where high-tech medicine is really beginning. I mean, you have your first shock wards, which is the first emergency rooms. You have your first, X-rays. All of these things have a wartime component of the technology behind it, and the urgent need for healing people in a wartime environment. So World War II really kind of set things off.
It was so fascinating. One of the ones I thought was really fascinating was the Enola Gay, which was the actual plane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has a connection to kidney transplant, right? In a weird way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a very distinguished doctor at the Brigham in Boston named John Merrill, he was the flight surgeon of the Enola Gay. And he had extensive training in the effects of radiation on the human immune system and the blunting of the immune system by radiation. His partner, Murray, who was also at the Brigham, had done burn grafting during the war again, and noticed a lot of things about how certain blood types the graft took and others it didn't, and how the immune system was undoubtedly involved in the rejection. And so putting the pieces together using a dose of radiation as a way of blunting the immune system was one of the key breakthroughs that allowed the first transplants. And that happened at the Brigham in what was it, 51.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. And then explain something called the kill dialyzer, because that's like the worst name ever for anyone on dialysis. But the kill dialyzer, what was that exactly?
Yeah, it's one of these. Instead of a rotating drum, which is what Pim Kolf and Merrill perfected, there were these flat plate dialyzers where blood and the dialysate were flowing along horizontally along a plate. And Fred Kill, Kiil, was a Norwegian doctor and technologist. Again, a lot of these doctors were also tinkerers, MacGyvers, creators, and we'll get to another one pretty soon, the Scribner. But yeah, the Kill dialyzer, unfortunate a name as it is, it was also an incredibly good dialysis system, and it produced some of the best results ever. In fact, that's what was state of the art in the late 50s.
And then you brought up Scribner, right? And the Scribner shunt, right? That was a revolutionary thing. Why was it revolutionary? But also, there was a dream sequence here, right, or something that kind of led to this, right?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about this rotating drum and the Kill dialyzer is that it produced a method by which you could bridge a critically ill person, someone with rhabdomyolysis, or someone whose kidneys have failed for whatever reason, could bridge them and keep them alive until their kidneys restarted. But what if you had someone whose kidneys were not going to restart? What if their kidneys were gone? Then you were kind of out of luck, because in the early days, each time you attach the person to the machine for dialysis, you basically destroyed a major blood vessel. And it's after a while you run out of blood.
Is that right, or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think arm, leg. They were using everything. The last ditch effort was the groin, and then sorry, lights out. That was the kind of the nightmare scenario for Scribner, but also for the few early doctors, the early nephrologists. And I think he had a particular patient named Joe Saunders from nearby Spokane. He was based in Seattle. Scribner was based in Seattle, and he had an emergency kidney patient rushed to his hospital, Joe Saunders, and he was in horrible shape, and foam was coming out of his mouth, and heart failure, and all this stuff. And in a short time, with a couple dialysis treatments, Joe Saunders was up and about, walking, looking healthy, but they discovered that his kidneys were irreparably damaged, and he was going to go into kidney failure. And at that point, they did what they could do. They basically said, "Sorry, Mr. Saunders, we've got nothing here," and they sent him home, and he died peacefully not too long after, several days after. But that apparently triggered something in Belding Scribner's deep psyche, because not too long after, he had a dream. He doesn't apparently remember the dream, but he remembers the the idea of having tubes permanently in the patient's arm, and corking them and uncorking them, to use a non-technical term, whenever you needed to attach the person to the machine. And thus was born the Scribner shunt. They used Teflon, which is another brand new technology, so to prevent clotting, and they fitted their patients out with Scribner shunts, and in very short time, you had people who were dying within at best a couple months to living 20 years or longer on dialysis, because they could reattach on a regular basis.
And that then eventually led to the seminofistula as well, too, right? When they created the seminofistula in the arm, which was your actual vein instead of an artificial tube, right?
Right, exactly. That's only 5 years later, in 1966, that this seminofistula comes through. Exactly.
That's amazing. And so, I mean, to me, that's the other thing I was going to bring up. The first kidney transplant. So the first kidney transplant was actually in Paris, correct?
Yeah, the very first one was at the Necker Hospital in Paris, and as it happened, John Merrill, who we've been just talking about in Boston, was there on an internship at the time, and the head doctor, well, you wouldn't say nephrologist in those days because it was before nephrology was an official thing.
Yeah, yeah.
The head,
You just
internal
called him a
medicine
genius, I guess, at
expert.
that time. I was
Yeah,
kidding.
guru, genius, exactly,
Yeah.
lifesaver. Is a guy named Jean Hamburger, which is spelled hamburger but is not pronounced hamburger. And he was another breakthrough, another fascinating guy. And yeah, it was Christmas Eve in 1952, and he received a young boy who had been who had been badly injured in a scaffolding collapse, and he had only one working kidney, and that kidney had been irreparably damaged. And his mother, and this is never had human beings had organ transplants before. This was a new thing. His mother pleaded with the doctor, who had been working with cadaver, transplants and so on, pleaded with him to use one of her kidneys on her son. And it was successful. It was a successful operation for 2 weeks. And then the immune system kicked in, because again, they didn't have immunosuppressive drugs. They didn't know at that point, they hadn't put the pieces together about radiation. And so they really literally just went in with and it went fine for 2 weeks. And then sadly the boy died. But again, that was a key part of the experience base for Merrill and Murray back in Boston, and I'm trying to think exactly what the date of it was 3 years later. So it was 1954. They had two identical twins, who one of whom had the Herrick twins, one of whom had kidney failure, and the other offered his kidney.
That was stateside, right? That was stateside.
That was stateside. That was in Boston, exactly.
And that was a twin, right?
Now you come back over the pond, and we're in Boston. And first of all, there was a huge debate about whether that was ethical at all, whether it was ethical to allow the brother to undergo the risks of a major surgery. Was that Hippocratic? Was that kosher?
Technically that's not malfeasance, right? That's actually hurting another person. I remember that.
That's the big. There was a lot of debate about that. And in fact, we'll get into this later, but dialysis was a key component of bioethics coming into its own as a field, because dialysis poses so many hard questions about what's right and wrong, and what the role of high tech in medicine. This was another one.
Well, this brings to, like, weirdly enough, my frustration with the industry versus where it was, right? So, I practiced for 13 years, and over that time, luckily now we're starting to see some innovation, but for 10 years, I was literally practicing the same medicine I was practicing in 2010. Do you see what I'm saying? And it hadn't progressed, but nephrology was the most innovative field at the time, right? Like, it was cutting edge. And even if you think about what you're doing on dialysis, it's astonishing that we can even do that, right? Like,
it's amazing to me. I mean, I write a bit about Claude Bernard and the interior milieu, this notion of how the kidneys, among other things, keep a perfect balance in our internal system so that everything works. All of our internal organs work, our muscles, our nerves. Those kidneys are like the conductors of this great symphony of the human body. And yeah, it's incredible to think.
That's why we're better than cardiologists, okay? That's why we're better than cardiologists, right? You tell my parents that,
way
okay?
better. That never crossed my mind, yeah.
We're bragging points to your parents, okay? But yeah, no, that's the amazing side. And I think you even brought up the evolution of life, right? Coming out of the ocean and having the body having to balance salt and electrolytes more rigidly because we were out of the water, right? And how that developed into the kidney and all that kind of stuff as well too. So,
exactly.
Yeah. So we're talking about the innovation centers, right? And you bring up these names of people. Where were the two innovation centers really in kidney innovation back in the day? Where were those two locations?
Yeah, really, it's kind of a tale of two cities, as other authors have said. It's Seattle on the West Coast and Boston on the East Coast, and there are a lot of other examples of Cleveland.
No, I'm not taking away from any other place that was innovating, but it seemed like in your book you highlighted these two for various reasons, not just the innovation, but their mindsets on how they approached it too, right? So
yeah, they were kind of emblematic about a very, very different approach to providing care. I mean, the fundamentals of good dialysis at the Brigham and at the University of Washington Medical Center were the same. And they were long, slow, gentle dialysis. They worked out a lot of the shortfalls of dialysis, the binders that need to be used in order to sort of what the machine, as magnificent it is just isn't a patch on the actual kidney. I mean, if you want to talk about miraculous, what the kidney is doing, the many things it's doing. So when you take the kidney away and replace it with the machine, there are a lot of things. So both the Harvard, or the Brigham, and people who were trained at Harvard Medical School, and the Seattle team headed by Belding Scribner had largely the same idea about quality of dialysis. The problem was when it came time to roll out dialysis at scale, when in the early 70s, dialysis became the first Medicare for All program, and a lot of money started pouring into dialysis. There was a fundamental difference of opinion between the Harvard folks who spun off a new company, for-profit company called National Medical Care, and proceeded to create the first dialysis giant. And their theory was, we need rigorously for-profit clinics. Doctors have to have a participation in the profits of their centers to incentivize them. They were very, very much Reaganomics, Milton Friedman-esque thinkers.
I believe the phrase they used was because believe self-funding dialysis would help more dialysis get to more people, right? That's what their philosophy was, right?
And at the beginning that was true to a point, because people were dropping dead because of the lack of supply of dialysis. So getting as many clinics out there up and running as quickly as possible, valid to a point. The problem is that the point is reached where profits trump patient care, and that's where you get into trouble. And that's what the rest of my book is about. So on the other coast, you have a very different model. The Seattle people,
and that was the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center was the first dialysis center ever. Correct? Is that right?
Right, and they were. It was in a nearby hospital. The actual hospital where Scribner was working, UW, declined to expand his facility because they said, "Look, your treatment is working, and these people are staying alive for a long time. We don't want to be on the hook if our funding falls through." And he's like, "Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to have to find another model." And he went out to the community. He did fund drives, and they started the first dialysis clinic, really, in the nurses' hall of a nearby hospital that would take them, the Swedish hospital in Seattle, Washington. So, but they had a not-for-profit, community-funded view of dialysis, and a rigorous division in their minds, Belding Scribner and others' minds, between patient care and profit. And they really felt like it was essential that this remain nonprofit, and all the more when it was cleared for Medicare, and this huge wash of money began pouring into the industry.
And and they also stressed the Seattle model stressed slow speed, long dialysis, right, and home dialysis. Correct? That's what they stressed.
Right, exactly. Home dialysis is one of the key things. The famous Kill dialyzer, which did not kill, but kept they were. I mean, some amazing stories of people who were living. I mean, some of his early patients, Scribner's early patients, and again, these are people who were virtual guinea pigs. They were learning about phosphate binders. They were learning about all these things.
I can imagine. I just can imagine like
they'd say, "Doc, it hurts. I have these nodules," and they're like, "What is this?" "Well, let's see. Oh, you could try antacid because that reduces the aluminum." There was a lot of creative medicine going on there, but there was a lot of trial and error. These people still lived 20, 30 years on dialysis, and went back to work. And had a work life and a home life. They dialyzed at home. They had control of their lives. This remains absolutely to this day state of the art. The right way to do dialysis is home dialysis. You have control over your time and your treatment. You have control over your life. You don't have to be transported or drive from place to place. You have a hope of of a work life as well. It's something that was very much a part of the Seattle model, and frankly the Boston model. Once NMC, the National Medical Care, the for-profit company, got rolling, it was all about numbers. It was about as many clinics as they could put out there, as many patients as they could process through them. And very, very soon the problems started. And KT over V is the perfect tool for.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that the KT over V.
Yeah.
I thought you brought up a really interesting point. And KT over V, guys, if you don't know, that's the clearance of how much we clean your blood, and we base how well we're effectively cleaning your blood based off of that number, the KT over V, or the URR, urea reduction ratio. So go ahead, go into that and how that played a role.
Yeah, because how do you, in the early days, even figuring out when you were doing a good job was tricky, right? Because there were no textbooks on nephrology. How do you know whether the good clearance? What's good clearance? And so, in 1981, one of the Harvard brainiacs, Edmund Lowry, was the lead author of a report published in the New England Journal on it's called the National Cooperative Dialysis Study, NCDS. And it was the first randomized controlled trial of the dialysis dose, and it highlighted KT over V, the urea clearance. Now, urea clearance is a handy number. It's easily cleared. It's water soluble. It's small molecule and so on. But it left out a whole bunch of other things. I mean, urea is by no means the most toxic. I'm telling you, right? You know far better. Yeah. There are like 90 plus uremic toxins, and we're not even talking about fluid management. I mean, the whole idea of fluid overload as one of the critical things to patient health. You just focus on KT over V, get your patient where you need them, 1.4, whatever it is, and turn off the machine, wheel them out, and wheel the next one in. And unfortunately, that does predictable harm.
It's amazing how when you set a metric or you set a number, people just they think that that sets the precedent for everybody, right? In a weird way, and everyone just follows through.
Well, again, it's
almost just focusing on that as opposed to the whole, right? So
yeah, it's super useful to have protocols and to do studies that set guidelines. But when you have someone with a pony in the race who is setting your guidelines, and we'll get to EPO in a minute, another gruesome story of conflicts of interest. That's a problem. And it's also a problem when you simplify an incredibly complex thing like the kidney down to one number. I mean, you know far better than I how many things the kidney is doing. You measure one number, which is actually a pretty easy. So it's easy to get in 2 hours at high ultrafiltration rate to get the urea clearance that you want. And then you're done. But actually, you're not done. Your patient is not healthy. They're sick. They have these, and there's a really moving scene that I tell in the book where a young nephrologist is saying, well, I don't know any patient who wants longer treatment. They're all begging me for shorter treatments. And, because they have nausea and vomiting and headaches and passing out and all this, and he goes down the list. And one of Chris Flagg, one of Belding Scribner's colleagues in Seattle said, yeah, because you're giving them short, sharp bazooka dialysis. That's not his phrase, but another short, sharp dialysis that causes those symptoms. And no wonder they want off the machine as quickly as possible. If you were
taking the model from
you're telling them.
Yeah, you were saying you're taking the model from an 8-hour slow removal of toxins from the body to a quick 4 hours. That kind of adds to the symptoms that patients would feel, or the tiredness they feel post, right? And
quick 4 or 3 or 2 and a quarter. I mean, I've heard some pretty horror stories. But the whole idea is that machines, the fast throughput model was machines are magical, and now we have this magic machine, and we just turn it on, and we have this number, and you hit the number. And like you said, if you have a metric, a lot of people are just going to track to that metric. So
yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. All right. So we created dialysis, right? But there was no funds to pay for it, right? So we had to allocate a scarce resource. So they came up with something called the God committees, right? And so what are the God committees exactly, and who are on them?
Yeah. Again, in the early days, this is in Seattle, but elsewhere, it was a huge responsibility. You had a lot of people lining up for treatment at your 4 chairs of dialysis or whatever it was that you had. Very few,
Yeah.
and only a tiny percentage of those people were going to be accepted, and the rest would die. There was there's no option. They didn't have the transplant available. They were going to die. And so the weight of decision on doctors was incredible. And in Seattle, they decided, meaning Scribner, but also the hospital management and others decided, no, we need to spread this. We need to distribute this responsibility over a society, because this is a societal thing. Again, it comes back to dialysis helping to jumpstart bioethics. And so they put together this admissions committee, they call it, but rapidly got nicknamed the God Panel or the Life and Death Panel, whatever. And it was a banker, a lawyer, a homemaker.
It was random people from the community, right? That's what it was.
I think they weren't random, but
Not
yeah,
random,
widely chosen,
wide array of people,
all over the place. Yeah, and reading some of the transcripts, they were rigorously anonymous, and the patient files that they were given to decide who would live and who would die were also anonymized. But it's really interesting to read some of the transcripts of the conversations. There was a key Life magazine article that came out about this in the I want to say 69, but in the late 60s that really helped to draw attention to this issue. And people are saying, well, the pastor is saying, gosh, I don't know whether medicine is outstripped, the technology has outstripped the ethics of medicine, and I don't know whether I'm comfortable with this. And the banker was saying, no, I don't feel too bad about not saying no to people, because dialysis is a rough life, and it's not made for not many people are made for it. So anyway, it was a way of distributing the responsibility of who lived and who died. The problem is that it was, it's deciding who lived and who died. Real life death panels.
Well, what's interesting is you have committees now, like on transplant committees, right? So you have like on a transplant, like the committee decides who qualifies for a transplant, who doesn't qualify for a transplant, or if they meet certain metrics or not. But those panels now are like doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, social workers, dietitians, and they have rigid criteria. You know what I'm saying? So objective criteria to meet. And I would love to hear some of the criteria they used to have. I mean, it would be just amazing to hear that, read those transcripts like you're talking about. But
some of the criteria are, can you pay for it?
Yeah.
Are you between 18 and 45, I think is the cutoff. So
yeah.
There are a series. Are you balanced? Are you contributing to society? All these really loaded questions, right? That
is such a hard question to ask.
That's a hard question. Yeah. And of course, they were immediately attacked. This is part of the reason why this whole part of dialysis jump-started bioethics, because you're really getting at the nitty-gritty of deciding who gets a scarce resource in medicine and who gets to live, and who's doing the deciding.
And so to me, like, this is where I'm taken aback by nephrology, because it's such a cerebral field, but like the innovation that was there, like, again, innovation not only in technology, but in transplant and in dialysis, but also the development of bioethics, right? Like actually deciding who lives or dies. Like that's a huge development in just medicine and humanity as a whole, right? Happened because of nephrology, right? In a weird way. So
absolutely. I mean, he was raising questions that no one else had been forced to face before, and it was raising them in a context of a life-saving breakthrough in technology. Really, one of the first high-tech medical breakthroughs.
All right, 1972 and Richard Nixon. What happened then? What happened to us then?
Yeah, well, the story in Life magazine, and then there was a big Edwin Newman did a big television show on dialysis and who lives and who dies, and a lot of these things started to echo in Washington. People started to say, wait a second, we're spending all this money on defense. Remember, height of the Cold War, but these people are dying because we can't spend, buy a few more dialysis machines. And so And so, and some of the early advocates for dialysis were very savvy. I mean, Belding Scribner and Edwin Lowery testified before Congress many times with their two very different approaches to dialysis and to medicine, of profit and nonprofit. But they had, a number of really, really smart allies that pushed dialysis towards towards becoming a Medicare for all, basically, program. Now, remember, cast your mind back way before you were born to the late 60s and the very beginning of the 70s, when America was on the verge of having national health. Everybody, the Republicans, the Democrats, the AMA, the insurance companies, everybody had a plan for national comprehensive healthcare, like every other developed country in the whole world. Congratulations. But at that point, it was just about to happen. And dialysis was considered sort of a test case for the first step in the breakthrough of national health. Sadly, it didn't go that way, but dialysis did get over the line. And of all people, Richard Nixon signed the bill. I mean, it's kind of dramatic because till the 11th hour, there was a lot of discussion about whether
there was someone that actually testified on the House committee floor, right, doing dialysis, correct?
Yeah, Shep Glazer, a shoe salesman from upstate New York, actually dialyzed on the floor of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he did it against doctors' orders, and he did it against the advice of the the better sort of strategic advisors, because they were afraid it was going to be a literal bloodbath. Something would go wrong, he would die, and the whole thing would be shot. Something did go wrong. He had some kind of arrhythmic problem, and they had to interrupt dialysis after minutes. But no one sitting up on the dais knew that, and it totally got their attention. And he was very, very eloquent in saying, "Look, dialysis. I mean, kidney failure is a threat to the American dream. I bought a house, back when a shoe salesman was able to, that was a real job back in the 70s. I bought a house, I have kids, I have, what would you do if you were in my position? Would you, but I can't afford dialysis. My kidneys have failed. I can't afford dialysis. What would you do? Would you sell your house and you worked so hard for, again, the American dream thing? Wouldn't you want to see your kids grow up?" He was very eloquent, very passionate, and a lot of people, again, feeling that come hell or high water, we're going to have national health very soon anyway. This is a great starting point. They said yes, and so the Congress passes this as part of the Social Security, and Richard Nixon signs it into law, and Medicare guarantees to pay the vast majority of the payment of dialysis and transplants for everyone with kidney failure in America. Virtually everyone in America who has kidney failure.
To me, like, just watching someone do dialysis at that time, like, I've actually seen someone actually present for home dialysis, like literally in a hall in a hotel one time as an advocate for home. And while he was talking, he was actually cannulating himself, setting him up, and talked about his life experience and all this cool stuff. And so I could see how it could be, and it actually did convince me. Like, it was, again, this is a side note, but he was one of those patients that he was an in-center patient that he was like, I was that guy. I was that guy that never showed up, never did anything. But once I started doing home dialysis and started taking care of myself and took control of my health, I became very compliant and stuff. So it's a very telling story when you actually see someone do that. So as we evolve here, we went to Medicare is paying for it. You have certain companies start to arise, right? You have like Gambro, Total Renal Care, NMC, Fresenius, all these kind of players come out. And then you go into the book about certain concepts that you bring up that I thought were very fascinating. One was what they call stealth consolidation, right? That happened in the industry. What's stealth consolidation, so people understand what that means?
Yeah, stealth consolidation is, it's actually a term I think was coined by an economist at the University of Chicago, Thomas Woolman, and he basically he coined it in a paper with a great title, "How to Get Away with Merger," which is actually about I know you can't do this stuff.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
How to Get Away with Merger, but literally, the title is what he's talking about, and basically between 1996 and 2017, dialysis companies attempted or carried through something like 4,000 acquisitions of smaller entities, half of which were not even reported to the FTC because the value of those deals was below the threshold of reporting requirement.
Yeah.
So, but
ordinarily, if two big companies merge, the FTC has to approve it for monopolistic reasons or whatever, right? So they got around it by saying instead of acquiring a big company, they just went around, picked out little players around, and kind of made it a bigger company, right?
Yeah, and if you were again selling shoes, it would be one thing, but you're selling a product. You're giving a service that is extremely geographically limited. I mean, someone, if they're not doing it at home, they have to go to that clinic, and that clinic needs to be near their home, so they can't shop around, right? So
Yeah.
by buying up, and Woolman's thesis, and it's pretty effective, is that ultimately, if the FTC had been doing its job, and if those 4,000, half of those 2,000 transactions had been examined, they would have been refused because it was helping to create a monopolistic situation in local markets.
Interesting. Then you bring up another concept, fast food medicine, right? And what does that mean exactly? I mean, all my dialysis patients eat fast food, so it can't be that, right? but fast food medicine, what is that exactly?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's basically the concept, like many concept, is a decent one, and that is, what is fast food? It is a product like McDonald's French fries. All right, I'm not going to do an ad for McDonald's French fries. Wherever you go in the world, you have something, what it is. It's always pretty much the same. It costs very little, and you don't have to wait very long to get it. You're not worried about whether you're going to get sick from it or not. That's something you should be worried about. But so the idea of fast food medicine, which really came out in the 60s with, oddly enough, with some people who had experience, HCA, the hospital chain, was co-founded by a guy named Jack Massey. And Jack Massey made his name creating the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise. He also had a big role in Wendy's. So he knew about fast food. And they were some of the early people to push this idea. Look, we need to already costs management was a big concern in DC and in America. Runaway healthcare costs, and fast food medicine was a way to say, look, we can do this short, simple, always the same, following the protocols. And again, to a point that can be good. Always wash your hands before you cannulate. That's a good rule, right? Always follow that rule. But when it comes down to treating medicine as a fast food item, and when it comes down to fast food medicine really being about cutting costs to the bone, and increasing profits to the maximum. I mean, ultimately, a very good economist, Ryan McDevitt, who knows a lot about dialysis, written a lot about dialysis, said, ultimately, at the end of the day, we found out that people are not burritos.
Yeah.
That ultimately, it sounds good on paper, but fast food medicine is a recipe for disaster, especially in a case like nephrology, where each and every patient has a very specific set of needs, very different physiological needs. A treatment needs to be, you hold the prescription pad, Kasim. You are the one who decides for each individual person. And if someone is above you telling you, no, this, and maximize your EPO and minimize this and they can't use that because that's too expensive to use this, who's practicing medicine here? You?
Yeah. Well,
protocol?
I think you see it a lot. Like, I'm not saying, I would say I call it more of the assembly line mentality when the dialysis unit becomes so big. Like, I think a cozy one of 12 to 15 chairs is nice. And some of the big ones of 30, 40 chairs, when it gets to that size, it almost becomes like an assembly line of thing. And don't get me wrong, there's some doctors that do it very well and they have good units, and some places that have big units. And sometimes with the big units, you get economies of a scale, right? Not just for profit perspective, but just for efficiency perspective. But I do notice that once you get to those, like when you start having like a 30 chair, 40, 50 chair place, and all of a sudden you have 3 or 4 shifts a day, that kind of mentality can kind of set in. There's another concept you brought up, and I thought this was interesting, the tone at the top, right? And that's something you find that was kind of not flagrant, but prevalent in the industry as well. What was the tone at the top? What does that concept mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a concept in management that was actually a, kind of originated back after some major scandal. I want to say Enron, but it was actually probably before some major financial scandal where it was proven that the CEO, the C-suite, but primarily the CEO, had set the tone of an organization, and it didn't really matter what the compliance manual said, or what all their shareholder announcements said, or what, their disclosures to various regulators say. It's what that person, that CEO, and usually larger than life, male, with a pretty outrageous lifestyle, that tone at the top sets the tone for everyone in the organization. And so no matter, there are two rules of the road. There's the rule of the road that's official, like what we really are doing here as Deutsche Bank,
Yeah.
and what the real game is, and that's what's signaled by the top players. This is how you should. So if it's a, I don't know, just to take a random example, if it's a nonprofit about feeding homeless people, and the CEO is driving a Bentley, that's
Yeah.
that's a message that doesn't,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And his, I say his, quite often it's a he, sometimes a she, but quite often it's a he. His signals quite often are picked up by his wannabe henchmen, his lieutenants. They start driving what they can, and all of a sudden you have this disconnect between what the official mission of the company is and what's really going on. And that's
What I find interesting too is like, and I think this is something not just in the nephrology profession, but other professions as well. You can say accounting, you could say, or finance or whatever. But oftentimes we do walk the line of ethics a lot in whatever field we're in, and I see what you're getting at. Like if the organization top people are kind of crossing that line sometimes, and you may not see it as bad to cross that line, right? And so,
especially, again, this is dipping into whistleblowing experience. I mean, you arrive on the job and they say, "Hey, go watch Joe. He's the top salesman for our product. Go watch Joe." And you find it's your first day on the job. You go watch Joe, and Joe's selling up a storm, and you gradually, over the months and years it takes you to learn the trade, you see maybe Joe's not quite following the letter of the law, but my boss's boss thinks Joe's great. He gets the top salary. He gets the top bonus. Are you going to call out the fact that Joe is breaking the law?
yeah.
This is a classic whistleblower case, but it comes back to your statement about, walking that thin line. You should, and the organization should applaud you for that. Depends on what kind of organization you're working in, whether they will.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about self-consolidation, fast food medicine, tone at the top. What happened to patient care along the way with those kind of, those things going on?
Well, basically, I mean, the Boston model won out. For-profit dialysis at scale won out, and the Seattle model of home dialysis, slow and easy, wins the race. Nonprofit, it still exists. Northwest Kidney is a fantastic outfit. They do great work out in the Pacific Northwest. They're the direct lineal descendant of Belding Scribner's work.
I just saw their website, so I was like, "Oh my god!" Yeah, I was like, "Oh my god!" They literally have him on his webpage. That's a pretty cool website to have that. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, they're terrific, and they follow the letter and the spirit of what Belding Scribner did. But a lot of other companies didn't, and NMC, National Medical Care, which is the Harvard Brainiac spinoff, they went their merry way. They grew and differentiated vertically and horizontally. They went into psychiatric care and all kinds of other stuff, and then ran aground with persistent accusations of fraud and paid at that time record legal settlement for all kinds of Medicare fraud. And this is a recurrent theme. The for-profit big companies go along gangbusters for a while, for various reasons are accused of and sometimes convicted of, but more often than not settle for a massive amount of money. That's a wonderful way of resolving an allegation of illegal behavior by saying, you give me $400 million, I, the government, will take that money and return it to the taxpayers, and we both get to say we won, which is frankly ridiculous. That's not justice at all. But anyway, that happened to a lot of
You're saying it's like when you find Google $1 million, right? They make $1 million in 30 minutes, right? So it's like it's not a, it's symbolic. That's what you're kind of.
It's a classic cost of doing business, and if that's what I have to do to it, and then I'll justify that. And then over the years, from the mid '90s, there was a successive series of consolidation of buyouts, larger dialysis companies buying bigger, smaller ones. Fresenius bought NMC in '96, and then the next year, Gambro bought Vibra, which was a California-based company, and then
Vibra became
DaVita. Then Total Renal Care becomes DaVita. Cantheri comes in and gives it a complete remake, and DaVita buys Gambro in 2004. This goes on and on and on until basically there are only two major companies standing: DaVita and Fresenius.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. But like one more thing I wanted to bring up. Well, not one more thing, a few more things, because you got a lot of knowledge there. But basically, what you're saying is, with this consolidation and fast food medicine, we had less self-care. RNs replaced techs, right? That's what started to happen too, and then less customization of dialysis, right? And so you started to see that kind of stuff happen. Then this is the one I found so interesting, the Epogen issue, right? So Epogen, so people who are non-medical out there, Epogen is a drug that's actually what we call an ESA, erythropoietin stimulating agent. It's produced by the kidney. As kidney disease progresses, your ability to secrete that hormone goes away. So people on dialysis oftentimes have to have Epogen or a similar agent to kind of help them make blood. Cancer patients have it. Lance Armstrong uses it to win the Tour de France. It's like a really it's out there, right? But in general, what happened with Epogen and nephrology that was really just kind of ridiculous?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic case of perverse incentives. I think Epogen was introduced by Amgen in 1989. 1991, Medicare said, okay, we're going to change the way in which we reimburse the drug, and we're not going to pay it on a blank fee, sort of irrespective of dose fee, but we're going to pay it per dose, and that meant that you get a payment, you being a dialysis company, Amgen, but the dialysis companies that Amgen was dealing with get a payment on every dose of Epogen that you use, and I'm going to let you guess which way sales went of Epogen as soon as that change happened. Did they go up or did they go down? Yes, they went up, and they went up through the roof up. I mean, the EPO became, one of the first billion-dollar biotech drugs, and Amgen is pushing, aggressively promoting its use in dialysis as well as chemotherapy, suggesting ever higher doses of EPO. Amgen is also getting involved to help. Again, we're talking about who sets the rules of the road. They get involved in the DOKI, which can become KDOKI guidelines. They get, their paid consultants to help weigh in on setting the appropriate levels of Epogen. Okay, and I mean, all of this is just worst case scenario.
At that time, Medicare, the Epogen became the largest cost drug for Medicare, right? Back in like the 90s, correct?
And exactly, the largest single drug expenditure in all of Medicare was EPO. And by 2000, and by 2007, represented nearly half of the cost of dialysis treatments.
Yeah, so I want you to repeat that. Okay, in 2007, it represented half the cost of dialysis care. One drug, is that right?
One drug. That's exactly right. In 2007, yeah, exactly.
That is crazy. Go ahead.
Yeah, and by then, between 1989 and 2010, Medicare spent more than $40 billion on EPO. So that was a massive amount of overuse. Well, here's the deal. Okay, a certain amount of EPO is critical, and again, I'm preaching to the choir here. You need it for sure. You should say this bit, or I'll say it in a dumbed down form. A certain amount is really important, to allow you to absorb oxygen. Maybe not win the Tour de France, but if your kidneys are not working, you need this to have a good quality of life. Too much. And again, in crude terms, thickens the blood and causes an increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and various other things. And the FDA started to get in, and they started to write black box warnings and recommendations and various other things. There's some serious peer-reviewed science that said stop using so much EPO. The companies, the big companies, and Amgen behind them, kept on using that EPO, no matter what. And there's a famous 2007 interview with Kent Thiry in the New York Times, and he was asked, would he, how would he react if they removed this bonus basically of per dose on EPO, and they put EPO into the bundle, and this sort of blanket payment for all dialysis drugs. And he said, "Oh, do it tomorrow. We're still going to use the same amount of EPO. That's not going to change." Well, they did it. They changed the payment thing, and they bundled EPO in 2011. And in that year, DaVita cut their usage of EPO by 47%. Fresenius was up around 30%.
So this is when the bundle payment, just so everyone understands, instead of paying a la carte for drugs and various things, Medicare said one dialysis treatment for everything that's involved, you get one single amount of money. So you can't a la carte bill various things. Once that happened, the utilization of that drug went down dramatically. Is that correct?
Yeah, once that happens, essentially overuse of EPO becomes a cost and not a
revenue stream,
not
right?
a profit. Yeah. And so what do you do if you're a bean counter? Well, you cut your costs. And what do you do if you're a patient? Well, you go to the hospital for transfusions, or you feel horrible, or there are lots of things when people were just radically reduced in EPO. But that's an example of perverse incentives that frankly CMS helps to create. They're part of this whole picture, and the payment model is a huge concern. How dialysis is reimbursed has always historically been one of the incentives for whether or not good dialysis is going to be practiced in America. And all too often, CMS has been on the side of the bad guys.
Yeah, interesting. And then you talked about, I thought it was interesting, Kadogi's, like in 2001, they came up with the CKD 1 through 5. And I think you talked about one nephrologist, or maybe there was other evidence as well, but having problems, right, with that kind of stratification, right?
Yeah, it was Dr. Stephen Rosansky, who's a distinguished nephrologist. He worked also at the VA for a while, and he's very thoughtful about how we got where we are. And one of the things he said, of course, he has seen what dialysis is like inside the VA, in-house, versus VA patients, veterans who are outsourced to dialysis providers. Big questions there. Anyway, he said, yeah, he was, really when this, again, when you apply a schema and you say a cutoff, and that cutoff is EGFR of X, 15, whatever it is, then all of a sudden there will be a number of nephrologists who say, right, 15, dialysis time, boom, for you.
Yeah.
And he said, look, you're not taking into account how rapidly that is declining. I mean, you're not taking into account a bunch of things that you take into account, how the person is doing at 15.
Yeah.
And he said, well, it's a lot of my colleagues just say it's just easier. Plus, we're getting paid, right? If you manage them at home and then you're not getting paid. So again, there's a when you set that kind of a model. And by the way, the threshold for going on dialysis, or for many nephrologists recommending dialysis in America, is a lot lower than in other countries.
I think, even with the EGFR, it's interesting. I think it's very subjective. Like, this is where the art of medicine comes into play. And so, like, I think everyone's got, like, if you go to a spine surgeon, everyone's got their threshold to cut, and with nephrologists, I realize everyone's got their threshold for starting dialysis. And as I get older or more involved, as the years go by, I have a very high threshold before I ever start dialysis. You see what I'm saying? Meaning I'm going to wait till you feel like crap, or maybe start just before that point and then start dialysis. So you can take a person to a GFR of 7, 8 sometimes, depending on how they're doing. But it's a really subjective call, because the EGFR calculation is almost like a BMI calculation. You have to put in other factors and confound other factors that go around it, right? So interesting. Then you point to, and did you want to give a caveat here? Like, you talked to some, intimidation and retaliation of patient complaints and stuff like that was going on and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and before I published my book, I shared some of my stronger allegations with some of the companies that are the topic of my book, including DaVita, and they had some very strong rebuttals. They wrote back and said none of this is true, and I printed those responses in the first chapter of my book and throughout my book wherever I say these things. So basically. If you were to talk with their managers, they would say Tom's full of shit. I mean, this is completely wrong. But I stand by my 6 years of reporting. I stand by my 60 pages of endnotes. I stand by what I say, and I'd encourage people who are listening to read the book and draw their own conclusions. That's all I can say.
Okay. And then let's talk about the Three Musketeers and dialysis. So bring up that component. I thought that was fascinating too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's tone at the top. It's about creating an ambiance. And, okay, dialysis is a tough pull. If you're running a dialysis company, it's hard for the patients, but it's hard for the workers too. I get this. I mean, a lot. And one of the things I really want to stress is my book is not a condemnation of American dialysis workers. Not at all. Some of the most compassionate, amazing people I have ever met, I met on the blood floor or coming off the blood floor, who told me what's going on. So and the difference that a single person can make to turn a facility from average to stellar is incredible. So I mean, I do not want my book to be considered some sort of a blanket condemnation of workers. They are, in my view, co-victims of the fast food model. So anyway, if you're running a dialysis company, you might want to find ways to kind of try to lighten the tone a little bit and liven things up. And again, based on the history, which is widely known. I mean, there are Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School case studies about Kent Theory and his founding of DaVita. So it's widely recognized. The musketeer thing was, all for one and one for all. We are all in this together. We're pulling for the company, which in his view is actually a village, and he's the mayor. And he's also said that he works in sort of military style behavior and religious elements and so on, just to strengthen the company culture. Well, one of the things is the Three Musketeers, and I describe it in my book. I mean, all of the things that I'm talking about are described in detail in my book. But there is a famous, infamous company skit that was made at one of the nationwides that DaVita employees gather at, and it seemed to be produced by the company, and it shows three masked evil villains, all dressed in black with black masks and black hats and black capes, and they have swords, right? Play swords. And they come out and they introduce themselves and they say, we found your company is doing wrong. And the crowd goes, boo, boo, boo. And we're going to cut into your profits. Boo, boo, boo. And then one by one, the Three Musketeers arrive, and they're senior members of the company. You can identify who they are. And one by one, they sword fight and play kill these masked evil villains. Okay. So who are these evil villains? Well, one is a federal prosecutor. They introduce themselves at the beginning. Federal prosecutor, a CMS claims adjuster, and an insurance executive. So these are the bad guys that the heroic, musketeer has to kill in order for their company to go on. That's a pretty strong message. And again, that's just a video. It's but people were cheering. So I thought it was a kind of an interesting thing, both as a journalist, but also having worked at Goldman Sachs, having worked in a big company. So that feel how that's generated is
it's interesting how this corporate culture comes out, right? And I think like some of these companies, that it becomes almost like a cult of personality, that you're like, this is our guy, he's kind of nutty, but he gets stuff done. So I guess that's how he's oftentimes perceived. And even when I've talked to different, sometimes you talk to entrepreneurs and they walk the line of like, dude, is he crazy or is he a genius? You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't know. And so sometimes you go along with it. It turns out he's just crazy.
Yep.
And
exactly.
so,
No, that's exactly right.
but I can't imagine being in a Three Musketeers outfit. That's hilarious. That is
Well, in
just
fact, the word cult comes up a lot when you talk about DaVita. I mean, it's something that I interview David Barbetta, who is a whistleblower, who used to work in the finance department at DaVita, and he talked about people in the company saying, "Have you drunk the Kool-Aid?" And there's this wooden bridge that you have to walk across in order to enter the. And it's all this sort of weird stuff. Which, again, if you're a manager and you're trying to get people psyched up about their daily grind,
yeah.
maybe it's but when you start stabbing federal prosecutors, I don't know, I'd draw the line there.
Yeah. And you also, the concept you talked about was the idea in nephrology, or not nephrology, in the industry, how the regulated become the regulators, I guess, right? Like people from industry wind up working for CMS and back and forth, right? Or like there's a back and forth there. What issues do you see with that, and what happens there?
Yeah, I mean, people who go from the White House, very senior level healthcare, to the board of a major dialysis company, or go from the board of the major dialysis company to the head of HHS. These revolving door situations, they can't be good for the average person. It's very good for the company that
Yeah.
that gets a lot of clout in DC, but it can't be good for making objective, quality decisions about how patient care is going to be carried across the nation. That's just so these I find, and again, this is something that I ran into so much in whistleblowing. Revolving door is a fancy way of saying corruption.
Yeah.
Just like unlimited corporate donations to political figures, no matter whether it's been blessed by the Supreme Court in 2010, that's corruption. And until we start calling it by its real name, we're lost.
Well, it's interesting because like I could see how to regulate industry, you have to understand the industry, right? So like, for instance, now the big thing is AI, right? So everyone's talking about AI, but no one in Washington knows what AI is, right? Some of them can't even spell it, right? So like, it's like a very difficult concept for them. So it's like, you almost need people in the industry to go there, but like, do you put regulations on them after they leave that, hey, you can't go work for the company you just help, regulate or.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is a bilateral. This is both the Republicans and the Democrats have perfected the art of revolving door behavior. And Nancy Ann DeParle went from the Obama White House to DaVita. Tom Scully did the opposite. It's fine to talk about expertise, but when you're also making massive amounts of money, then that's not okay. And it's also true that, for instance, AI, take a good example. I mean, I've had conversations with coders who are helping to write the code for self-targeting killer drones. Okay. And they say, that's not on me. I don't have any responsibility. It's just code. I'm just writing this stuff. I'm like,
Yeah.
I beg to differ. You have a huge responsibility. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
That's crazy. But if you're so far into it, you're just like, it's just technology. It's not going to hurt you. A little more, a little less. Not until it draws a bead on your forehead.
Yeah.
So I that whole thing about you have to have insiders. No, you want outsiders. You want people who haven't played the game and aren't going to go on to the next cushy job. That's who you want making the decisions.
Yeah. Let's go into, before we start to take some questions, but let's go into some of the patient stories you brought up, and not just the complaints, but I would say some of the more interesting ones as far as, positive takeout. So you talk about this old Jewish guy in New York City that wanted a pastrami sandwich, right? Tell us that story, and I'll go into it. Go for it.
Yeah, this was told to me by Dr. Leonard Stern, who founded the dialysis unit at Columbia University, and he's a passionate advocate of home dialysis, and he has this great story about this elderly Jewish guy who was miserable in clinic, and he had this dietitian who was really on his case and couldn't have this and salt and that. Rightly so. I mean, it's important to have rules when it comes to sodium and various other things. But he was miserable, and so the gentleman and his children arranged with Dr. Stern to do home dialysis, and right away having it at home, having it in a familiar environment, having it when he wanted it for as long as he wanted it was great. And frankly, if everyone could be treated by Dr. Stern, dialysis would be a different world. But also, Stern got a call one time from, I think, from the daughter saying, "Oh, dad wants pastrami, but the dietitian says you can't have pastrami." It's like, give him a pastrami sandwich, for goodness sake. This is comfort food for him. It's part of his growing up, and he needs this. He'll only eat a little bit anyway, and he has to stay a little bit longer on the machine. So be it.
Yeah.
Dr. Stern says again and again, he still thinks about it. The gentleman passed away a number of years after, and surrounded by his family in a peaceful, the way we would all want to go. And Dr. Stern still remembers those times and feels still a part of that family.
I think I think the assembly line mentality, the one size fits all, like kind of leads to that. Like there's oftentimes doctors that talk very rigidly about diet, or even dietitians that talk so rigidly about diet. And sometimes you have to, because you don't want them escaping. But when this old guy just had a comfort food that changed his perception of life, like a little pastrami sandwich, you just let him have that win, right? As opposed to fight him on every bit of it. And you can see it too. Like I'm in Texas, so I have a huge Hispanic population, and they love guacamole, dude. And avocado, and avocados have high potassium, but that's literally like the only healthy food they eat. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I hate to take away that avocado, which is such a healthy food, away from them sometimes. So it's like that balancing act you want to play. You talked about a PD patient who did martial arts along the lake, right? That was one I thought was interesting too. Remember that guy?
Oh yeah, Justin Charles Evans, who's a stuntman and body double, and an incredibly powerful person, brave. And he was encountering all kinds of bad behavior at his facility in Atlanta, and he and a number of other patients, all of color, were being systematically mistreated. And they would just show up, and there would be a sign on the door: "Today, no dialysis. Sorry, go to the emergency room if you have to." And after a while, this was putting people's lives obviously at risk. I mean, at one point he went to the emergency room. He had such a high potassium. They're like, "Whoa," just about to, to clock out. Anyway, so he's an organizer, and he put together a letter to the then U.S. senator from Georgia, one of the two, and the letter got passed from the senator to the senator's staff to CMS back to the clinic where he was being mistreated. And all of a sudden, the hammer dropped. He and the other people who had signed the letter were systematically retaliated against. They were threatened with, and then eventually, involuntarily discharged. He was accused of carrying a gun to the clinic. I later talked with the nurse who wrote that accusation in his medical records, and she admitted to me that she had done it at the advice of, on the direction of, or the orders of, the clinic manager, and that she had never seen a gun in his possession. So he was terminated. He was discharged from that facility, and he kept on going, and he managed to get himself into it. First of all, he started doing it at home.
He did PD, right? He did PD eventually, right? Yeah.
He did PD for a while, and then back to hemodialysis at home. And now he's back in clinic, but I'm concerned about news that they've shortened his treatment time, increased his UFR, and he had a coronary arrest last year. He was gone for 11 minutes. He's back, but it's not good. So these are the kinds of things. I mean, I've lost a lot of people. A lot of people I interviewed are no longer with us, and it's hard. It's hard.
I remember there's a quote too. You want to dialyze to live, not live to dialyze, right? That was someone that brought that up. And I thought that was really poignant. I think that's one of the big things about these patients. Their identity begins tied into being a dialysis patient, as opposed to just, doing dialysis and going on with your life, right? So I think that's...
Yeah. And the original vision of Congress is you could do dialysis so you could get your life back. You could get back into the workforce. You could continue paying taxes. You could have a life. And in fact, now dialysis, at least in the fast food, assembly line dialysis, is basically living to be dialyzed in many cases. And it's dreadful, I think, to see our most vulnerable patients taken advantage of in this way.
All right, guys, keep the questions coming right now. I'm just finishing up right now. Then we're going to take your questions from the field. Okay. Now I want to go to the future and where it's going and the changes you may have seen. We had the Advancing American Kidney Health Act in 2019 being signed at all, but President Trump at that time. There was 3 goals of that executive order: increase home dialysis, preemptive transplants, decrease the amounts of diagnosis of ESRD, and increase the number of transplants available, right? So there was like all these big 3 executive orders. What do you think of the executive order? What have you seen initiated since then? There's been a huge push in value-based care in nephrology. So what have you seen, and what do you think is going on?
I mean, the executive order was fantastic. And why was it fantastic? Because Alex Azar's father was on dialysis before he wrote that. I mean, the head of Health and Human Services under Trump. It's a fantastic document. How much has been brought into in reality? I don't know. Home dialysis is still, rock bottom. And the transplantation is improving, I guess, but there's a lot of discussion about that. I mean, again, I think that ultimately there are a lot of new innovations that will make home dialysis, hemodialysis, a lot better. And there are, of course, these new drugs, the Ozempics and Wegovy's of this world, that are offering new tools. At the end of the day, crashing into dialysis is the thing that gets me again and again. People should not be unaware of their kidney health, right? It's something like 37 million Americans have some level of kidney health, and only 10% even know it. And 60% of people discover it when they crash into dialysis. I mean, these are crazy numbers. And the cost, the societal cost of dialysis, $150 billion just for dialysis. I mean, with private and public. The cost is surreal, but the social cost, the cost to people's lives, is even worse. So if we don't do preventative medicine, if we don't start catching people before they crash, and if we don't start doing it at home when they do need dialysis, I mean, and again, your conservative approach is so great, and I've spoken to many nephrologists who totally agree with it, and other nephrologists who completely don't. And they think I am absolutely evil, and that the things I've said in my book are just, fundamental.
I think like with home dialysis too, I think there's oftentimes you can talk to, malevolence or like being, persuaded by like money and things like that. But also I think there's oftentimes a group think in any field. And so irrespective of the money. So what's weird is in nephrology, I would say in fellowship, I could give, I was trained in on in-center dialysis. So when I came out of training, I wanted to do in-center.
That's what you knew. Yeah.
And I remember hearing this argument that nephrologists should be able to give peritoneal dialysis orders as quickly as they give in-center dialysis orders. Do you see what I'm saying? And so like I could give you the dialysis orders at 2:00 in the morning, half asleep, regurgitate them, a patient crashing in the ER, half asleep like this. And my wife can give them too because she's heard me do it so many times, right? So, but like PD, I still have to think about. Do you see what I'm saying? Because I wasn't trained on that modality as much. So I think there's a group thing. The other component of home dialysis, I think, is a barrier. Is it is a burden on the patient and the family there too. So there is a home burden too. And I think the market penetration, probably with the current technologies is 30 to 40%. That's my kind of bias just with the current technologies. But what's good is you're seeing more technology companies coming in with more user-friendly devices and all that stuff. But I think you're right in the sense that we need that mentality change, that doctors are doing that. Now, one of the good things about the Trump executive order, I thought, was the transplant bonus. I don't know if you saw that, 15,000. That moves the needle. Moves the needle. And so, and also even the
positive incentive. I mean, we talked a lot about negative incentive. That's a positive one. Yeah.
That's one like that moves the needle. And unfortunately, sometimes when you give like a 5% increase in payment year on year or something, like that doesn't change behavior. You see what I'm saying? And so some of that kind of stuff is there. I'm interested to see, because I've seen a lot of innovation on the value-based side, to see what happens, what players come out, what kind of, what actually happens. I fundamentally think like it has to, like even the principles of like that we talk about, home dialysis, early referrals to kidney transplant, getting them on medications to prevent the progression of kidney disease, that needs to be taught in programs like fellowship programs, right? Not just be some the value-based medicine players are saying that, right? Like, so that's the other thing. But
No, 100%.
let's take some questions from the audience here. Let's see here.
So
We got a lot. Let's see here. Okay, Jim Turner, he always comments a lot of this stuff. So why do you think the government seems to always side of the company so easily?
Well, again, we talked about the settlement procedure, and again, this is a gross generalization, but I'll generalize. It's never stopped me before. The Department of Justice is a bunch of lawyers, and lawyers who are trying to make a good career, and if they can have the chance to get 100, 200, 500, $6.5 billion settlement out of a big corporation, or they can try to criminally prosecute them where the bar is much higher in terms of proving
civil versus the criminal.
Yeah, civil. And they're going to choose the safe option. They're going to choose the multi-billion-dollar settlement and get to pat themselves on the back and put that on their resume. And then when they look for their next job at the white-collar law firm that's defending the defendants against their former colleagues at the DOJ, here we are with a revolving door again. I mean, you know, in many countries, you have a separate career path for government prosecutors and for private lawyers. And there's a very good reason for that, because when you mix them, when you give that carrot at the end of, you know, your stay at the DOJ and 10 times your salary, again, there are some fantastic DOJ lawyers. I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but the incentives are not positive when you have this kind of revolving door.
We got another person saying, what's Tom's views on AI's place in clinical setting, both administrative and care? What are you thinking about it? And what have you seen?
You know, I think what an MD said to me a few months ago, they said, you know, we've already seen that cell phones have had and apps have had a degrading effect on our connection to patients. Now we're going to have fake doctors with fake voices speaking. It's just going to be, you know, that much. It's going to be depersonalization, dehumanization to the next level. And I hate to say it, but garbage in, garbage out. This whole AI, you know, there's some potential, you know, uses where obviously where you're interpreting at high speed a bunch of scans, for instance. There are some very valid uses for AI, but this whole notion that somehow there's a great recent study that showed that war games done by AI, only AI, almost automatically escalate to nuclear war.
Oh wow! Wow, that was like the movie from the 1980s. That was the movie from the 1980s. Yeah.
What's that? Sorry.
There was a movie in the 1980s. I forgot what was it called. War Games? I think it was called War Games when they played.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that. It was before my time.
You have something to go at Blockbuster Video tonight.
Yeah, but literally about 2 months ago,
there
was this major study that was published in the New Scientist, and I think Stanford researchers showed that these war games done by AI escalated to nuclear war every single time. You're like, whoa. So we should not look for wisdom, let alone conscience and ethical behavior from our digital creations.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I've started, you know, I work with a company that does AI, and it's interesting. Like, I think it's really good for examining data and seeing patterns in data that otherwise wouldn't be there. You know, I think that, and it's like, you almost have to stratify it into like developmental stages, right? So if they can handle your insurance approval and scheduling and simple things that would actually make life better for a physician, it'd be interesting. When you're talking this high level, making clinical decisions, or even being an AI interface with the patient, would be really, it's going to be interesting to see. But I think like the ethics evolve with the generations. Do you see what I'm saying? So you and I may not connect well to, you know, virtual reality or even social media to that degree as, say, a younger person does, right? So it's going to be interesting, like that level of trust. You know, you and I are like, no, I want my privacy. But like a younger generation is like, I don't want my privacy.
What's that?
What's that? Like,
exactly. No, I mean, I would say on the pro side of AI.
Go ahead.
I would say on the pro side of AI that I would want a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or who's also versed in AI and can use it as a good tool. Because
I look at it as a tool. That's 100%.
Yeah, because I mean that's the perfect combination of someone who, you know, a Formula One driver with a Formula One car, that's a great race. And so giving them the tools, that's key.
I got an excellent question from a nephrologist here, Bijal Patel. He's actually the head of oh my god, Balboa Nephrology in the San Diego SoCal area. He asked, what advice would you give patients or families navigating the dialysis industry based on your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, he asked good questions. That's a problem.
Second and third opinion about when to start.
Okay.
And
I actually think that may be a good idea, Tom.
In writing.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, I have them one now and again. No, but in writing, get the reasons why you're being started on on dialysis. In writing.
Got it.
Is it just your creatinine? I mean, is it, tell me why you're starting me on dialysis. Explain to me in clear detail the alternatives, and explain to me in clear detail any financial benefits you may have from me starting on dialysis. Now, this is the worst case scenario, right? This is I'm saying, okay, how to avoid a horrible situation. But I do think those are valid questions. On the other side, really trying to stay off dialysis as long as possible. This is not quite part of the question, but people should be testing their kidney function regularly. Read my lips, right? I mean, no more crashing into dialysis.
I think people have to ask about it. So unfortunately, most people don't know what the kidneys do, but it is checked on routine labs. So if you're going for your annual labs, you should ask what your EGFR is, what your creatinine is, and all that kind of stuff. Another nephrologist commented, it's Raythi Jiwala. She's actually, I think, in Austin. Love the understanding of this history. So I think, again, as a nephrologist, your telling of the history is so amazing. Let's see here. We're working against the sales conversation. Been on the wrong side of the conversation. The working against rules says, okay. Someone pointed to some of the sales conversations you were talking about there. Another on Amy Kosak. She's a proud CEO of Central Florida Kidneys, and she's celebrating 51 years as a nonprofit. So she's on your camp there. Bijal Patel asked a good question. Bundle payments and outcomes based help regulate the dialysis industry. Do you think the bundle payment helped regulate the industry much?
Yeah, the bundle payment is, again, it's a product of a society that went from the Great Society building good things for people, including national health would have been a good thing, to cutting costs, always cutting costs. And CMS's approach to the reimbursement, it's easy to beat up on the big companies, and I've done that in my book. What I didn't do a proper job of in the book was looking at what CMS has done to contribute to this mess. And I think, the way in which the bundle payment is the lowest common denominator, the way in which they ignore time and ultrafiltration rate, and until very recently, blood flow rate, again, the KT over V is sort of the gold standard, and failing to encourage patients in their own care. I mean, to engage them. I mean, it's one of the absolute fundamental rules of treating chronically ill patients is to get them in charge to the extent that they possibly can of their own care, not be a passive victim, but an active participant in their own care.
And Jessica Davis, Jessica Davis, she's an RN, she's a dialysis nurse. She looks like, any thoughts on patients participating in the care? I'm a 9+ years in dialysis RN, and I rarely see patients take ownership. And so you wonder how much of that is the patient, how much of that is us. You see what I'm saying? So I think, and it's
absolutely. I mean, it's a bit like treatment times. People, many patients, I've said to many patients and many doctors, hey, you should have a longer treatment time. And the patient is like, no way. I get sick. I have a headache. I have cramps. There's no way I'm going to stay on that machine longer. What they don't know is that short, sharp treatments are killing them. And that if they had longer, gentler treatments, those symptoms would probably diminish. So, I get why people are passive in a situation that simply, I mean, I've had people describe the dialysis that they were undergoing as cattle call dialysis. They're being herded in, put on the shift, taken off, hurry, no time to talk with again, this is something that healthcare workers, dialysis techs and nurses constantly, back in the old days, you got to know the person, and there's no time for that. So anyway, anyone who's a patient in this system and feeling crappy all the time, they're not going to be really dynamic about their care, but it's kind of an artifact of their care.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see it both ways. I could see how me rushing through a dialysis unit can, you know, and trying to get those 4 visits like we're supposed to can kind of make them seem like I don't care when I'm just trying to rush and get to the next people. But the other side is, even when I engage, some people don't engage back, you know, and so it's like, how do we open those lines of communication between each other? But Tom, this was awesome, and I sincerely appreciate you coming on. I have the book. You guys, you need to check it out. He does make some controversial statements and talks about the industry, but you need to read it to actually understand it and, you know, come to your own judgments. But you did reach out to all these companies and all these people to get their commentary as well, right? So, yeah. So anyway, Tom, any last words, man? I so appreciate you being here.
Now, Kasim, thank you, and it's inspiring to speak with someone who has this approach to dialysis, which is not one size fits all, but absolutely tailored. And your patients are in good hands. They're lucky.
Well, thanks, man. Well, guys, thank you so much.
And the fact is, you guys still hold the prescription pad. Nephrologists tomorrow could take this industry back.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my part.
Anyway, wonderful having you, Tom. Thank you. And guys, please feel free to leave commentary, and we'll hopefully answer them later if we can. All right. Well, have a wonderful day. Remember, guys, it's your kidneys, your health. Okay. 1 second.